Evening. Hi, I welcome everybody, and I want to share a text about Robert Sapolsky that I have pirated from web. Somebody has written elegantly about him. I wouldn't be able to. As a boy in New York City, Robert Sapolsky dreamed of living inside the African dioramas in the Museum of Natural History. By the age of 21, he made it to Africa and joined a troop of baboons. Although the life of a naturalist appealed to him because it was a chance to get the hell out of Brooklyn, he never really left people behind. His gift for storytelling led the New York Times to suggest if you cross Jane Goodall with a Brock belt comedian, she might have written a book like A Primate's Memoir, Sapolsky's account of his early years as a field biologist. The uniqueness of Sapolsky's perspective on the human condition comes from the ease with which he combines his insights from the field with his findings as a neuroscientist. What makes Sapolsky great is that he connects science with society and human life and with human nature. He tackles the question of human mind with similar questions that kept Aristotle, Copernicus, and Shakespeare awake in the middle of the night. For more than 30 years, Sapolsky has divided his time between fieldwork and primates and highly technical neurological research in his laboratory at Stanford. As a result, he can effortlessly move from a discussion of pecking orders in primates to an explanation of how neurotransmitters work during stress and gets laugh during it. Sapolsky regards this sobering news with characteristic good humor, finding hope in our own capacity to prevent some of these problems and the small steps with which we live our everyday life. The humor and humanity he brings to sometimes sobering subject matter makes Sapolsky a fascinating speaker, as you will witness. He lectures widely on topics as diverse as stress and stress-related diseases, baboons, the biology of our individuality, and so on, you name it. Sapolsky is a MacArthur Genius Fellow, a professor of biology at Neurology and Department of Biology at Stanford University, and a research associate with the Institute of Primate Research at the National Museum of Kenya. In 2008, National Geographic and PBS aired an hour-long special on stress featuring Robert Sapolsky and his research on this subject matter. Sapolsky was awarded Rockefeller University's Lewis Thomas Prize for writing about science. His articles have appeared in publications such as Discover and The New Yorker, and he writes a biweekly column for the Wall Street Journal entitled Mind and Matter. In addition to A Primate's Memoir, Sapolsky has written 4 other books, including The Trouble with Testosterone, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, and Monkey Love, and other essays on our lives as animals. And his most recent book, Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. To quote my colleague David Eagleman, a neuroscientist at Stanford University, his latest book, as wide as it is deep, it is colorful, electrifying, and moving. Sapolsky leverages his deep expertise to ask the most fundamental questions about being human, from acts of hate to acts of love, from our compulsion to dehumanize and to rehumanize. We are delighted that Robert has accepted our invitation to talk about the biology of humans at our best and worst. This lecture is kindly and generously sponsored by a gift from Christina and Hamid Muqaddam to Iranian Studies program at Stanford, and by the Laboratory of Cognitive and Behavioral Neuroscience and Cognitive Neuroscience Interest Group. I welcome everybody, and joining me to welcome Robert Sapolsky. Thank you.
Well, singularly strange to have so many people in an audience not wondering if this is going to be on the final. So thank you all for being here. Now, Let me start off a little bit unorthodoxly here. Let me start off with a fantasy I first had as a kid. And it was a fantasy of the day I captured Hitler. I overpowered his elite guard. I burst into his secret bunker. I wrestled his Luger out of his hand. We grappled with each other. I pinned him down, got handcuffs on him, and was able to say, "Adolf Hitler, I arrest you for crimes against humanity." And at that point, the Medal of Honor version of this fantasy would get a little bit harder to maintain, and viscera would start to creep in. What would I do if I had had Hitler? And if I let myself go there, it wasn't actually hard to think about it. Sever his spine at the neck, take out his eyes, puncture his eardrum, cut out his tongue, inject him with some sort of cancer that would just pustulate in every cell in his body. I had this fantasy at various points when I was a kid, and sometimes I still do. And when I do, my heart beats faster, and my breathing gets faster. All this planning for the most evil human in all of history, the soul most deserving of damage, of punishment. Except I have a problem with that, which is I don't believe in souls, and I don't believe in evil, and I don't believe in punishment. I think Wicked only belongs in the title of a musical. But at the same time, there's all sorts of people I would like to see dead. But I'm against the death penalty. But there's lots of violent, schlocky movies I like going to. But I'm for very strict gun control. But then there was a time I went to that Laser Quest place, and I had such a good time hiding in a corner shooting at people. In other words, I'm your basic confused human when it comes to feelings about violence. Now, I don't need to get up on a soapbox here about the problems we've got with violence as a species. We've used shower heads to deliver poison gas, letters with anthrax, passenger planes as weapons, rape as a military strategy. We are a miserably violent species. But there's two problems with that, at least. The first one is we don't hate violence. We hate the wrong kind of violence. When it's the right kind, we get all excited. We leap in to see it. We hand out medals. We disproportionately vote for, mate with the people who are best at that. When it's the right kind of violence, we love it. The other complication is when it comes to being a violent species, we're just extraordinarily weird. I mean, some of the time, we're just like any old chimp. We could take some big old heavy rock and cudgel somebody's brain in. But some of the time, we can be wildly violent, doing nothing more metabolically taxing than pulling a trigger or signing an order or looking the other way or damning with faint praise or being passive aggressive. We do very odd things when it comes to violence. Let me give you one of the single strangest examples of violence I've ever heard of. And this is one having to do with Indonesia in the 1960s. Mid-60s, there was a coup that overthrew the government there, instituted a right-wing military dictatorship for the next 30 years, and in the year afterward, approximately 500,000 Indonesians were killed by right-wing death squads. If you were an intellectual, if you were a leftist, if you were of any of the ethnic minorities that were outgroups, their savagery, death squads would come to a village, systematically kill every single person in that village. So decades later, the writer V.S. Naipaul was traveling through Indonesia, and he would hear stories about what happened at the time. And he kept hearing this crazy story, which was sometimes these death squads would show up at a village to kill everyone, and they would bring along a traditional Indonesian gamelan orchestra. Nuts. One day, he runs across one of these old grizzled veterans of one of these death squads, and he's talking to the guy, and he's proud to sort of brag about all the villagers and civilians he killed, saving the nation. And Naipaul finally said, you know, I heard this crazy thing about how sometimes you people would bring like gamelan orchestras to these massacres. Is that? And the guy said, oh, yes, whenever we could, we would bring an orchestra along. And Naipaul said, why would you do that? And in one sentence, the guy looked puzzled and just encapsulated everything that's weird about our violence. He said, to make it more beautiful, of course. There is no other primate on earth that could make sense of our violence when we're bringing along orchestras to make it more beautiful. Now, the single most complicated thing about us being this miserably violent species is, at the same time, we're the most altruistic, most cooperative, most empathic species on earth. And we're getting better at it. Consider, every single thing up here was invented in the last century. All these ways in which we are extending sort of an umbrella of empathy and protection in all sorts of unlikely directions. We're this phenomenally violent species. We're this phenomenally cooperative, empathic one. How do we begin to possibly make sense of the biology of us at our best and worst? Now, one of the things that's clear about it, it is utterly boring if all you want to figure out, try to make sense of us as a primate amid all the others. Where do these extremes of our behavior come from? It's totally boring if all you want to do is understand the motoric aspects of the behavior. Your brain tells your spine, tells your muscles to do something, and hooray, you've behaved. What's much more interesting is to understand the meaning of the behavior. Because in one setting, you pull a trigger and it's an appalling act. And in another setting, you heroically, suicidally pull fire onto yourself and it's an awe-inspiring act. In one setting, you put your hand on someone else's and it's a moment of deep compassion. In another, the exact same motoric behavior and it's a first step of a deep betrayal. The challenge with us in understanding our behavior is understanding the context of it. And that's real challenging. Now, one of the things that is absolutely clear with that is you are going to get nowhere in understanding these features of our behavior if you decide here is the part of the brain that explains everything that's going on, or here is the hormone, or the gene, or the childhood experience, or the anything. Here's the whatever that explains everything. Instead, if we're going to make any sense of these complex, context-dependent behaviors of ours, we have to look at many layers. So one of these behaviors happens. It's wonderful, it's appalling, it's ambiguously somewhere in between, and we ask the biological question, why did that behavior just happen? And when we do that, we're actually asking a whole array of questions. What went on 1 second before in that person's nervous system that instructed those muscles to do that good, bad, in-between behavior? But we're also asking what was going on seconds to minutes before in the sensory world that triggered those neurons. And we're also asking what was going on with hormone levels hours to days before that made that organism more or less sensitive to certain sensory stimuli that cause it, and then back to adolescence and childhood and fetal life and back to when you were just a fertilized egg, and then back to what sort of culture your ancestors came up with and what sort of ecosystems and what evolutionary forces sculpted all of that. If you want to get a sense, you're going to have to ask that question on all these levels. Okay, so beginning with that, one of our behaviors has happened and we do our first version of saying, why did that occur? What went on in the brain 1 second before that context-dependent trigger was pulled, that context-dependent hand was touched? Why did that occur? So if we're going to start off with the worst of our human behaviors, right off the bat, we start off with a part of the brain, the amygdala. The amygdala is about aggression. It's about violence. Stimulate the amygdala in a rat, a monkey, a human. You get unprovoked aggression. Destroy the amygdala. You're unable to elicit aggression anymore. The amygdala is about aggression. If you take an amygdalologist, though, and you sit them down and you say, what's the amygdala about? Aggression is not the first word they're going to mention. The first one is fear. The amygdala is about fear. It's about phobias, innate fears. Even more importantly, it's about where you learn to be afraid of things, fear conditioning and such. In other words, you cannot understand the neurobiology of violence without understanding the neurobiology of fear. And in a world in which no amygdaloid neuron need be afraid, there'd be a lot more of us sleeping between lions and lambs. Now, the whole thing about the amygdala and processing fear is it does something very interesting with sensory information. Okay, so you see something officially scary. Oh no, there's a rattlesnake. How does this get processed in your brain? The most straightforward thing is visual information goes to the sensory waste station, the thalamus, and then it sends it on to the visual cortex. And then begins a whole science fair project. The first layer of your visual cortex breaks this down into pixels. And then it hands it to the second layer, which turns it into lines. And then the next layer, moving lines. And layer after that, and layer, and going through your memory and like your golden book of snakes. And finally, somewhere up in your cortex, it says, oh my, that's a rattlesnake. Perhaps we should let those fellows down in the amygdala know about it. This is glacial from the standpoint of the nervous system. Turns out, in addition to that pathway, there's a shortcut. That very first volley of visual information getting to that thalamus has a shortcut that gets to the amygdala. In other words, the amygdala knows that you're looking at a rattlesnake while your visual cortex is still futzing around with the instruction manuals in layer 2. In other words, your amygdala can know what that is before you're even consciously aware of it. And this is all in the course of hundreds of milliseconds, tenths of a second. Okay, that's great. That's very good if your amygdala already knows you're looking at a rattlesnake. That's terrific. But there's a downside, which is there's a reason why you've got your visual cortex doing all that complexity. It's to make sure you're accurate about what you decide you're looking at. And that amygdala getting that lightning fast reflexive information is all set up to make a mistake. And before you know it, you think the guy who just happens to look in a certain way, the guy is holding the cell phone is actually holding a handgun instead, and you pull that trigger. In other words, the amygdala gets all this privileged information at the intersection of aggression and fear, this privileged information, but catastrophically at times, the information's not terribly accurate. Next part of the brain, area called the insula, insular cortex. Take any mammal out there and give it some rotten, disgusting, spoiled food to bite into, and as soon as it does, the insula activates, and that triggers all these reflexes. Animal gags, it spits it out, its stomach heaves, it throws up whatever. The insula keeps you from poisoning yourself with toxic food. That's great. So you get some like college freshman who volunteers for this and goes into a brain scanner and bites into some rancid, fetid food, and same deal, insula activates. But now instead, don't have the person eat something disgusting. Have them just think about it. Think about those little legs pushing against your lips as you try to, and you're going to activate your insular cortex. In most mammals, it does gustatory disgust, and us, it also does thoughts about gustatory disgust. But then something even more interesting. Don't give the person something disgusting to eat. Don't make them think about something disgusting to eat. Make them think about something else that's disgusting. Make them think about something that is morally disgusting. And the insula activates. In humans, this part of the brain also mediates moral disgust. And presumably 40, 50,000 years ago, when we came up with the notion of norm violations that could be so extreme that it winds up being appalling, they had a meeting, they said, we can't invent a new part of the brain. Once that insula does disgusting foods, disgusting behavior, I don't know, sounds similar, expanded in there, give me some duct tape, and now suddenly your insula also does moral disgust. That's why if something is sufficiently morally disgusting, we feel sick to our stomachs. It leaves a bad taste in our mouth. We feel queasy. Now this is great because this certainly gives a lot of visceral force to things that we find to be morally appalling. But there's a problem with this, which of course is that one person's morally disgusting behavior is somebody else's perfectly normal, loving lifestyle. In other words, moral disgust is a moving target. And the trouble with the visceral force of moral disgust is it just begs you to use it as a litmus test to decide, how do I figure out what's right and wrong in the world? Well, if it seems so different from what I normally do that I'm feeling a little queasy, it's wrong, wrong, wrong. And this wisdom of repugnance is a way of making some very bad moral choices. Okay, so what we see with the insula, most mammals, it's about sensory disgust. In us, instead, it's about moral disgust, which is intensely context dependent. And what we see there is the insula is central to us deciding that just because something is so different that it's hitting all sorts of visceral alarms, that there's something that's got to be, I can't tell you why, but when they do that, it's just simply wrong. And the first place in the brain the insula screams that news to next is the amygdala. Meanwhile, another part of the brain in reference to all of this, frontal cortex. Frontal cortex, the most interesting part of the brain. It's most recently evolved. We've got more of it proportionally than any other species. What does the frontal cortex do? It makes you do the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. Gratification postponement, long-term planning, impulse control, emotional regulation. The frontal cortex is the part of the brain that says, hold on, hold on, hold on, you're going to be happy you did it. It does all of those harder things when it's the right thing. Now, of course, the picture is frontal cortex and amygdala have a lot to do with each other, which is the frontal cortex spends a whole lot of time sending inhibitory projections down into the amygdala saying, I wouldn't do that if I were you. I know it seems really tempting right now. You're going to regret it. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't. Racing to the amygdala before that shortcut gets the amygdala to do something stupid and impulsive there. And the picture you get is basically all of the frontal cortical amygdaloid interactions are top down. The only thing the frontal cortex has to do with the amygdala is like showing up and preaching Christian temperance and things like that. And other than that, it's this very one-directional relationship. In actuality, it's two-directional, because we see versions of this all the time. This is every single time in some moment of arousal, of fear, of stress, of who knows what, you make some decision that seems brilliant at the time and you spend the rest of your life regretting it. It's not just one direction. Bottom up explains an awful lot of when we decide something is the right thing to do in one given moment and may not think that way 1.5 seconds from now. And what this speaks to is the whole notion of doing the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. The right thing is, once again, very context dependent. I mean, think about this. All of these are circumstances where you need self-control to pull things off. I mean, look at this. You're in a circumstance where you're being tempted to lie about something for personal gain, and you're trying to avoid the temptation to do that. Your frontal cortex is playing a central role if you're going to resist that temptation. But the second you decide you are going to lie, your frontal cortex is essential for you doing a good job at it. Remember, make eye contact now and then, and don't let my voice crack, and control. If you've got a part of the brain that's both central to resisting the temptation to lie, but once you decide to lie, doing a good job at it, this is a very, very complex brain region here. Okay. So the frontal cortex makes you do the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. That's very much a context-dependent behavior. And the main thing is the frontal cortex is not this gleaming cerebral bit of like cognition. It's just marinating all the visceral yuck coming up from underneath. It's a very bidirectional relationship. Few more brain regions. One more, the dopamine system. Dopamine, a neurotransmitter, one use of it in the brain in the mesolimbic dopamine system. Dopamine has to do with pleasure, with reward. Cocaine works on the dopamine system. Give a rat, a monkey, a human a reward from out of nowhere, the dopamine system activates. Dopamine is about reward. But then people figured out it's actually about something much more interesting than that. Now set up this paradigm. A little light comes on in the room as a signal, and that means if you go to this lever and you press it 10 times, you get a reward. Signal saying it's the start of one of those sessions, go do the work, you get a reward. Once that rat, monkey, human learns this relationship, what happens now? When does dopamine rise? Does it rise when you get the reward? Absolutely not. It rises when the signal comes on. That's the, yeah, I know how this works. This is going to be great. I'm all over this lever pressing stuff. This is terrific. Dopamine is about reward, but even more so, it's about the anticipation of reward. And remarkably, if you block the rise in dopamine there, the organism doesn't press the lever. It's about the goal-directed behavior. It's about the pursuit of reward rather than about reward itself. Now, what I just showed you in these circumstances was you press the lever, you get the reward. Press the lever, reward 100% of the time. What if now you switch things to you press the lever and only 50% of the time you get a reward? What happens to dopamine now? It goes through the roof like crazy. Because what have you done? You've just inserted a critical word into this neurochemistry, the word maybe. And nothing fuels dopamine like maybe. Being right on that fulcrum of today's my lucky day, but I'm such a screw up. But no, today's my lucky socks, but I'm a total dork. And just going back and forth on that. And that maybe, nothing cranks out reward-related behavior, motivated behavior like intermittent reinforcement, a maybe put in there. And this is what the neuroscientists who built Las Vegas know inside out, the power of this. Okay, so what's dopamine doing here? It's about reward, even more so anticipation reward, even more so goal-directed behavior in order to get that reward. And what we see is maybe putting uncertainty into the system is crazily stimulating. And if you want to take an organism and get it pumping out dopamine like crazy, all you need to do is put it in a circumstance when they are punishing an individual that has done a norm violation. We will come back to that. Okay, a couple more brain regions. Fusiform cortex, it's a primate specialty. It recognizes faces. Anterior cingulate, it has to do with empathy, feeling somebody else's pain, but they both come with fine print. Flash up faces. Fusiform cortex is activating. Flash up the face of someone from a different race, and on the average, the fusiform doesn't activate as much. The face doesn't register as much. You don't remember it as accurately. Show somebody a film clip of a hand being poked with a needle, and the anterior cingulate activates an empathy. If the hand's skin color is different from your own, it doesn't activate as much. Whose face, whose pain, all of these as qualifiers. Okay, so this begins to give us just a sense, tip of the iceberg, of what's going on in that 1 second before that behavior occurs. But no brain is an island, and when we look at one of these behaviors, good, bad, in between, and we're asking why did this behavior occur, we're now also asking something about seconds to minutes before. What sensory information had an effect on the amygdala, the frontal cortex, etc.? Where do these wind up being relevant? And what I put in this slide here is summarizing a gazillion different studies showing sensory information is altering our behavior in ways where we haven't a clue this is happening. For example, put up a pair of eyes on a bus stop and people litter less. Have a pair of eyes like that flash up subliminally for less than a second while somebody is playing in an online game, and they cheat less. They become more generous. You're being watched. Give somebody some horrible cod liver oil to drink and it tastes horrible, and for minutes afterward, people will be more punitive about norm violations. They're confusing a bad taste with a bad act. Or how about this one? Put somebody in a room and give them a questionnaire to fill out about their political views. And if there's smelly garbage in the room, people become more socially conservative. Doesn't do a thing to your economic views, your geopolitical views. You feel the same way about our trade deficit with Swaziland that you did this morning, but them and their different lifestyles suddenly begin to seem them and disgusting and wrong, just because visceral disgust alarms are going off because there's smelly garbage in the room. How about this one? Sit somebody in a chair, either a hard wooden one or a nice plush sofa like that, and give them job applications from like resumes of supposed applicants, and they evaluate them afterward. If you sit in a hard wooden chair, on the average, you are more likely to assess applicants as having a rigid, inflexible personality. You're more likely to think they're hard asses because of the chair you're sitting in. Or how about this one up on the right there? This was a study in PNAS, very prestigious journal, a few years ago, looking in a country, all of the parole board hearings in that country over the course of a year, 5,000 hearings, looking at who was sent back to jail versus who was given parole, looking at all sorts of variables, and out of it popped an extraordinary finding. The single biggest predictor of whether or not a prisoner got parole or not was how many hours it had been since the judge had had a meal. If you went before a judge right after a meal, 60% chance of being paroled. 4 hours later, down to 0. Just this line, along comes lunch, down again, little snack afterward, down again it goes. And what is extraordinary about this is two things. First, we understand the biology of this. Blood glucose levels have something to do with whether your neurons can work really hard. And what counts as working really hard in your frontal cortex? Viewing the world from someone else's perspective, trying to think about their mitigating circumstances. The frontal cortex takes a lot of energy to do the harder thing. And what's even more striking is, if you took any of those judges 2 seconds after they made that decision, and you said, okay, so why'd you send this guy back to jail, but this guy walked? They're not going to say, oh, because of my blood glucose. They're going to cite like freshman philosophy class or something. And all the while, this is the interoceptive, the internal sensory information that was shaping that decision. Finally, top left, the most depressing finding in this whole field is you take people, put them in a brain scanner, and you're flashing up faces like 1/10 of a second, barely noticeable, high speed, and for your average person, you flash up the face of someone of a different race, and the amygdala activates. Oh, crap. Hardwired on a 1/10 of a second to have a racist response like that. Is this inevitable? Is this hopeless for us to ever get? Now do the experiment a little bit differently. I recently found out that apparently San Francisco has a baseball team, and that supposedly they have this rival that they get very worked up about, and now you're flashing up the faces, and each face is wearing a baseball cap. And if you get the right San Francisco baseball fanatic, if it's the home team, you get one response. If it's the rival, the amygdala activates and you're not processing skin color. Oh my God, the innate nature of human racism, my ass. All it takes is this cultural thing we invented 1 or 2 centuries ago, and which one counts as an us or a them, and baseball loyalties overrides that, and you've recategorized people within milliseconds there. Okay, so in terms of the sensory stuff, we are constantly being buffeted, constantly being influenced by sensory information like this, and half the time we haven't a clue it's there or can't imagine it's relevant to our judicial decisions. Okay, so now pushing further back, our behavior has occurred. What's relevant in the hours to days before? What do hormones have to do with what goes on here? Now, if we're talking about humans at their worst, right off the bat, we know which hormone to round up: testosterone. So what's the deal with testosterone? Why are males of every species and every culture such a pain in the rear on this planet here? It's because testosterone makes you aggressive. Testosterone doesn't make you aggressive. Here's what it actually does. Take 5 male rhesus monkeys, put them in a group, let them form a dominance hierarchy. A defeats B 3 times, B never defeats A. This is the hierarchy. Now take C and inject C with testosterone. Give C like so much testosterone, like every amygdaloid neuron is growing antlers, and that guy just enormous. So now does C get involved in more fights? Absolutely. Is this the pattern that occurs now? Is C suddenly challenging A and B and rising in the heart? Absolutely not. C never does a thing with A and B. What happens instead is C becomes a total nightmare to D and E. Testosterone does not invent aggression. Testosterone exaggerates pre-existing social patterns of aggression. And it turns out it does something even more subtle than that. And this is people beginning to realize what testosterone really does is when your status is being challenged, testosterone makes you do whatever you need to do to maintain status. Now, if you're a baboon and somebody's challenging your status, the way you maintain it is you have a fight with them. It's synonymous. But if you're human, things get more complicated. And for example, you can have an economic game where people get status by making generous offers, and give people testosterone, and they become more generous in the game. In other words, if you shot up a whole bunch of Buddhist monks with testosterone, they would run amok doing random acts of kindness all over the place. The trouble isn't that testosterone makes us aggressive. The trouble is that we reward aggression with status so readily. Meanwhile, if we're talking about sort of the good side of our behavior, the hormone that immediately comes to mind is oxytocin. Oxytocin is officially the grooviest hormone in the world. Oxytocin promotes mother-infant bonding, pair bonding, trust, expressivity, cooperation, generosity. Give fruit flies oxytocin, they become better listeners, all sorts of stuff like that. Oxytocin promotes pro-social behavior. Oxytocin does no such thing once you look more closely. One example of this was worked on a few years ago in the Netherlands, and volunteers there were given this classic problem in philosophy, the runaway trolley problem. A trolley is broken loose from its brakes, it's hurtling down the tracks, it's going to kill 5 people. Is it okay to push 1 person onto the track who will be killed but will slow down the trolley? Can you sacrifice 1 to save 5? Basic utilitarian stuff. Philosophers have been dealing with the runaway trolley problem since, I don't know, Aristotle took his first trolley. It turns out how How you frame it matters. Is it okay to push a person versus is it okay to pull a lever that dumps the person? You get totally different answers from people. Okay, so they give these volunteers the runaway trolley problem. And the key thing in this study was they gave a name to the person you were pushing on the track. Either it was somebody with a classic good old boy Dutch name like Dirk or Peter or something, or it was one of two groups that consistently evoke negative connotations in Holland, people from Germany, oh that's right, World War II, or people with Muslim names. So now you got a choice. So are you going to push Dirk onto the tracks? What about Wolfgang? What about Mahmoud? And it turns out you give people oxytocin and they're far more likely to spare Dirk, and they fall over themselves to throw Otto and Wolfgang and Mahmoud under the tracks there. Oxytocin doesn't make us more pro-social. It makes us more pro-social to people who feel like an us. If it's a them, it makes us crappier and more xenophobic to them. So in both cases, we've got hormones affecting our brains, our sensory systems, but far more subtly than you might think. And the problem with testosterone is that we reward status to aggression so readily, not that testosterone causes it. And the thing about oxytocin is it doesn't make us more pro-social, it exaggerates this divide between us's and them's. Okay, so now pushing further back with our behavior. What about weeks to months before? And the critical thing in this realm is, it turns out over that time span, the brain changes. The brain changes dramatically. Neurons form new connections. They shrivel up old ones. Brain regions get bigger. They get smaller. It's the biggest revolution. Top left, it turns out the adult brain in one region makes new neurons, completely new neurons under certain circumstances. The brain shows neuroplasticity. Incredibly exciting stuff, with all sorts of fine print there. First off, amid having the brain having this enormous potential for neuroplasticity, there's limits. No amount of neuroplasticity is going to make any of us into a yo-yo ma, or no amount of neuroplasticity currently is going to do much for you if your spinal cord has been severed. Moreover, more importantly, neuroplasticity is a value-free phenomenon, because sometimes neuroplasticity can make you much better at being a saint, and sometimes it can make you better at ethnically cleansing villages. It's not an intrinsic good or bad. Now, pushing further back, how about back to your adolescence? And it turns out everything about adolescent behavior is explained by two facts. First off, your dopamine system is going full blast by the time you're about 11 or 12. Second, your frontal cortex is half-baked when you're a teenager. Frontal cortex is not fully online, amazingly enough, until you're about 25 years old. In other words, this is why juveniles behave in juvenile ways. Impulse issues and sensation seeking and novelty seeking and peer effects and conformity and all of that. And what's this for our purposes? What is this relevant to in terms of that second where you either are or aren't going to pull that trigger? What this tells you is late adolescence, early adulthood is when environment is having its biggest effects on what kind of frontal cortex you're going to have as an adult. And that has a critical implication. Okay, so adolescence is all about dopaminergic maturity, frontal cortical immaturity. But the critical thing there is, if the frontal cortex is the last part of the brain to come online, by definition, it's the part of the brain least shaped by your genes and most shaped by your experience and environment. And it's got to be that way, because what's the difficult, subtle, doing the right thing when it's the harder thing to do kind of stuff that takes forever to master? Cultural relativity, context-dependent rules. Thou shalt not kill, but it's really good to kill them, and you don't lie, but this is a good time to lie, and hypocrisy and self-serving stuff, and that, no genes are going to code for that. Your frontal cortex needs 25 years to master stuff like that. Hurtling further back, how about now back to childhood? What does that have to do with the adult brain and adult decision you will make in that 1 second there as to what to do? All of it is built around something that is totally obvious, which is childhood matters. And different types of childhoods produce different types of adults. And the central question in that field is, how do different types of childhoods produce different frontal cortexes and different amygdalas and different, what are the mechanisms by which early experience has a lifelong organizational effect on brain and behavior. Now, what this brings us into is this insanely trendy field called epigenetics. Genetics, your genes, your DNA sequences, experience doesn't change those. What epigenetic experience changes, though, is the regulation of those genes when they are activated. Okay, what would this look like? Amazingly enough, it turns out in the world of rat mothers, some rat mothers are better at mothering than other rat mothers. Okay, what counts as a good rat mother? She picks up her pup a lot, she licks it a lot, she grooms it a lot. This is a wonderful rat mother. And it turns out if you are subject as a rat pup to such attentive rat mothering, that causes an epigenetic change in a part of your brain. And as a result, as an adult, you secrete lower levels of stress hormones into your bloodstream. Great, but with an interesting implication. So because you were groomed and licked a lot as an infant, your brain epigenetically shifted, and now as an adult, you have nice low levels of stress hormones. When you are a mother, because of those low levels, you're going to lick and groom your kids more. And thus, this trait is going to be passed on to the next generation, not through genes, but through environmental, experience-dependent changes in regulation of genes. And the same thing works prenatally. You're a rat fetus, and you're being exposed to tons of stress hormones. Why? Because your mom is stressed and secreting a lot into her circulation, which gets into your circulation, which gets into your brain, and causes epigenetic changes such that, as an adult, your amygdala is going to be bigger, and it's going to be more reactive to threat, and you're going to have higher stress hormone levels. And as a result, when you're pregnant, your fetus is going to be exposed to more of these stress hormones. In other words, we have early environment shaping all sorts of aspects of how the brain and the endocrine systems are put together. And most importantly, thanks to these epigenetic changes, starting during fetal life, environment does not begin at birth. These changes can be long-lasting, lifelong, even multi-generational. Okay, but now, one step further back, forget when you were a kid or a fetus. How about back when you were nothing more than just a fertilized egg? What do genes have to do with it? And there's no subject in this whole lecture that's more contentious than the role of genes and behavior. And this is because we live in an hysterically giddy period about genetics these days. We've sequenced the human genome. They can do it in an evening now if you go into the right, like, McDonald's or whatever. The genome, or the code of codes, the holy grail, the notion that your genes shape everything that happens in you. And the thing is, your genes have no idea what they're doing. Saying that a gene knows, for example, when it is going to regulate cell biology, saying that a gene knows what it's doing is like saying that a cake recipe knows when you're going to make the cake, or decides when you are going to make the cake. Genes don't regulate themselves. What regulates genes? Environment does. Environment can be very local. The local environment in a cell that's running out of energy, and that turns on a gene which makes more of a glucose transporter protein, and the cell takes up more energy. Change in environment alters gene activity, and you fix the problem. Or environment could be on the level of the whole body, high levels of testosterone, and as a result, in this muscle cell, certain genes are turned on, and the muscle cell grows bigger. You put on muscle mass. Or environment could be environment in the conventional sense. You've just given birth, you smell your baby, and as a result, genes are turned on, and you start making oxytocin. Oh my God, genes run all of life. They're the same. You smell your baby's tush, and as a result, you change gene transcription. Genes don't really know what they're doing. Genes are being regulated by environment. And the critical thing is, different environments regulate the same genes in different ways. Do not dream of writing down any of this, but what we have here are a whole bunch of genes that have effects on behavior only in certain environments. For our purpose, the most interesting one in red there, a gene called MAO alpha, monoamine oxidase alpha. It's got something to do with this neurotransmitter, serotonin. All that matters is it comes in two different flavors, and by all logic, one of those flavors should set you up for higher levels of aggression. And a huge study was done some years ago following 17,000 kids for decades, and the answer comes back: if you've got the wrong version of this gene, you are indeed, as a young adult, more likely to already have a history of antisocial violent behavior. If and only if you were abused as a child. If you weren't raised with abuse, zero effect whatsoever. In other words, it's not what the gene is, it's not what the environment is, but the interaction between the two. In other words, genes decide nothing. Instead, they're being regulated by environment sufficiently so that it never makes sense to ask what a gene does or an environment does, only in a particular context of interaction. Okay, that's great. So that tells us something about why genes in a penguin may work differently in the middle of the Sahara or something. But yeah, you're not going to see penguins there, but you're going to see humans there, and in Antarctica, and in tundra, and in rainforest, and polygamous societies, and monogamous, and capitalist, and socialist. There's no species on Earth that lives in more different environments. Thus, by definition, there's no species on Earth that is freer of genetic determination than we are. Okay, so now we're back to fertilized egg. That's the end of us. But amazingly, we got to push further back, because to make sense of all of this, we now have to ask, what were your ancestors doing? What sort of cultures were they inventing? Because that's going to influence how you are going to turn into that adult that you are. What sort of cultures did they invent? Turns out to be very sensitive to what sort of ecosystems they lived in. For example, across the world, desert dwellers are statistically more likely than chance to invent monotheistic religions. Rainforest dwellers invent polytheistic ones, and all sorts of baggage that goes along with that. Another pattern: when you look at humans living in small hunter-gatherer bands, the religions they invent involve almost all the time involve gods who could care less what humans are doing. It's not until humans are living in sufficiently high density that you're interacting with strangers, that you interact anonymously, then humans start inventing what are called moralizing gods. Gods who are watching us, and gods who are judging us, and gods who are the pair of eyes up there on the bus stop there when we're getting complex enough that we can't do it ourselves. Or another critical distinction has to do with traditional ways of making a livelihood. In the traditional world, people are either top left, hunter-gatherers, top right, agriculturalists or horticulturalists, or in the center, pastoralists. Pastoralists, people wandering the grasslands or the deserts with their herds of camels and cows and goats and all of that. And there's a particular vulnerability if you're a pastoralist. If you're a rainforest hunter-gatherer, bad people cannot come at night and steal your rainforest. If you're an agriculturist, they can't come at night and steal 20 acres of your maize. But if you're a pastoralist, people could come at night and steal your herds, rustle your herds there, and everywhere around the world, pastoralists come up with cultures of honor, built around violent retribution, warrior classes, honor killings, vendettas that stretch for centuries. And what is most remarkable is, within minutes of birth, if you were a child in a culture of honor, your mother is speaking to you at a higher volume and holding you for a shorter length of time than if you were a child in one of these other cultures. If you were born into a collectivist culture, on the average, your mother is nursing you for longer lengths of time in your first week of life than if you were born in an individualist culture. In other words, within minutes of birth, everything we've already seen is now being shaped by what your ancestors were doing for a living centuries before. In other words, ecosystems shape cultures, shape brains, shape behaviors. And some of these differences are manifest within minutes of birth. In other words, brains and bodies and behaviors and cultures and genes all co-evolve. Finally, if we're gotten this far back and we're talking about things like genes, by definition, we're talking about evolution. What does the evolution of behavior have to do with any of this? And modern thinking about the evolution of behavior has long ago trashed the notion that we behave for the good of the species, or behave in order to survive. We behave in order to pass on copies of genes. Contemporary thinking about the evolution of behavior is built around three building blocks. First one, individual selection. What organisms do is try to leave as many copies of their genes in the next generation as possible, maximizing reproductive success, the selfish gene concept. And this explains a ton of human behavior. For example, remarkably, 16% of Earth's humans are direct descendants of Genghis Khan, the most reproductively successful human of all time. All sorts of powerful humans act to maximize their reproductive success. Next building block. Yes, some of the time you pass on as many copies of genes as you can, but some of the time an even better way of doing it is helping your relatives pass on copies of genes, kin selection. And humans have invented a version of kin selection that makes other primates shrivel up with envy. We can bequeath our material wealth to our relatives. There's inheritance. We have a way of magnifying differences through generations that way. We do kin selection like nobody else out there. Final building block, individual selection or helping relatives, or sometimes there's selection for cooperating with utter strangers, being cooperative and altruistic with them as long as they do it back. Reciprocal relationships of cooperation. And we obviously do that on a level like no other species out there. Forget scratching your back and you scratch mine. We've invented barter and economic system, all of that. In other words, the building blocks of modern evolutionary thinking explain a ton about human behavior until you look more closely. Individual selection. And then we have religious sects that are celibate, that choose to go extinct, like the Shakers, who don't pass on copies of your genes, behaving only for the good of close relatives. And then we have blended families with children adopted from all over the planet. Or reciprocal altruism, we will cooperate with strangers if they cooperate back. Think of this. This is a behavior we do which chimps could not possibly make any sense of. You're in a foreign country, you're going to the airport, you're about to leave there, you are never going to set foot in that country again. No person you see there you will ever set eyes on again. And as you walk into the terminal, you pause for a second and hold the door open for someone. Everything about the evolution of reciprocity and cooperation says there's no way that could ever become commonplace, and that defines us. In other words, evolution of behavior built around those three principles, they explain a ton about social behavior in lots of other species, and they explain a ton about us until you look more closely. Okay, so what have we gotten to now? We've now officially seen one of our behaviors occur, and if you want to understand if that behavior, you've got to incorporate everything from 1 millisecond before to millions of years of selection and evolutionary pressure. In other words, one can officially conclude at this point, it's complicated. Oh, great. I had to sit through 50 minutes of this to get to that point. It's complicated. Let's try to make that conclusion a little bit more useful. It's complicated, so be real careful and real cautious and real sure you really understand what's going on if you decide you understand why some behavior has happened, especially if it's a behavior that you're judging harshly. Now, for my purposes, the single most important thing about all of this is all of these realms of factoids I've been downloading here, all of them have one thing in common: they change. They can change over time. They change in response to experience. They change in the most fundamental ways over long periods, over short periods. Ecosystems change. This is a rock carving of a hippo, which was carved 3,000 years ago in the middle of the Sahara, when the Sahara was lush grassland. Ecosystems change. Cultures change. In the 18th century, the most terrifying people in Europe were the Swedes. They spent the whole century rampaging through Europe, and then something happened, something changed, and this is what the Swedish military does now instead. They haven't had a war in more than a century. Cultures change. Cultures change dramatically. Most importantly, brains change. New connections, lose old ones, expansion, contractions, brains change, behaviors change, people change. Sometimes astounding magnitudes of change occur. They could take decades. This man, John Newton, was a British theologian who in his old age played a central role in the abolition of slavery in the British Empire in the beginning of the 1800s. And amazingly enough, as a young man, John Newton made a living as the captain of a slave ship. And after he retired from the sea, he spent decades investing in the slave trade and growing wealthy from it, until one day, something changed. Something changed, celebrated in a hymn that he wrote that has made him famous, the hymn Amazing Grace. Another version of change that can happen over decades. On the left is a man named Zenji Abe on the morning of December 6, 1941, about to lead one of the squadrons of bombers, Japanese bombers that attacked Pearl Harbor. He was one of the lead pilots in it. And on the right is Zenji Abe to the day 50 years later, where as an old man, he came to Pearl Harbor, where there was a ceremony happening for the elderly survivors of the attack, and in broken English, he went up to those men and he apologized to them for what he had done. So change can occur on that level. Sometimes change can occur over the course of hours to days. One of the most remarkable events in World War I was the Christmas truce of 1914. The first Christmas, the first December, various powers that be decreed that there would be a 3-hour truce along the trenches in France, 3 hours in the afternoon before Christmas Eve, so that soldiers from both sides could come out, retrieve their dead from no man's land. So the fighting stopped, and people came out and retrieved their dead. And then they started helping soldiers from the other side carry their dead back. And then they started helping each other dig graves in the frozen ground. And then they started having ceremonies and funerals together and praying over each other's dead. And before it was over with, they were sharing Christmas dinner and praying together and exchanging presents and singing. And by the next day, up and down the trench lines of France, German and British soldiers were playing soccer together and weren't keeping score. And they exchanged weapons and they exchanged addresses so that they could visit each other after the war was over with. And they made vows with each other to shoot over each other's heads so they wouldn't hurt each other. And it took the officers arriving 2 to 3 days into this and threatening to shoot these men to get them to go back to trying to kill each other. And the main point there is all of that acculturation and all of that military training and all of that propaganda evaporated in the course of hours as to who counted as an us and who was the them. Us is us in the trenches, all of us in the damn trenches, and them is any officer in the back lines who would have us die for their power. And that just happened over the course of hours. And sometimes change can occur in minutes. One of the things that galvanized the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War in the United States more than anything was the My Lai massacre. A brigade of American soldiers went into the village of My Lai, undefended, no weapons, made up of elderly people and children, went in there and killed 350 to 500 civilians, mutilated bodies, gang rape before killing, killed every animal in there, burned the fields, an appalling atrocity. Appalling in part because the US government covered it up for a year. Appalling because when it finally had to admit it, it handed out just a slap on the wrist to the commanding officer. And appalling because almost certainly this was not the only instance of that. On the right is a man named Hugh Thompson. This is the man who stopped the My Lai massacre. Thompson was a helicopter pilot. He was piloting a gunship that was flying over the village, and he had gotten reports of shooting there, assumed that American troops were under attack from Viet Cong, flew over, landed there to see what help he could give, got out of the helicopter and saw American troops shooting old women in the head, saw American troops pulling babies underneath from out of their dead mothers to kill them, and this man saw what was happening. And at that point, there was a small surviving number of villagers huddling at one end of the village and a group of American soldiers coming towards them. And this man got in his helicopter and landed it in between the two, and he trained his machine guns on the American soldiers and said, if you make one more move, I will mow you down. In other words, over the course of minutes, he had completely changed who was an us and who was a them. And the main point of all of these people is none of them have any brain regions that we don't have. None of them invented any new types of neurotransmitters. They do epigenetics the same way we do, the same hormones, the same everything. They put their pants on one leg at a time the same way we do. Almost none of them had any indications beforehand that this was going to be someone capable of this sort of extraordinary change. So what I think we're left with here at the end is sort of an inversion of that like inevitable Santayana cliche of those who don't hunt and study history are destined to repeat it. What we have here, I think, is in fact quite the opposite. Those who don't study the history of astonishing human change and don't understand the science that begins to explain why to make that more likely, those of us who don't study that are destined not to be able to repeat moments like these. So on that note, thank you for your attention and good luck with your own best and worst moments. Thanks. Let's see. Questions, format? Sure. Yeah.
Well, I have a question. Is there free will, right? I mean, we're in particular makeup, and there is the particular stimuli which happened to me. Do I have free will, or will always completely predictable how I will react, given who I am, right?
Well, that's pretty rude. Well, actually, that's not rude at all, because, you know, if I'm trying to be a good house guest, what I would say is, well, if there is some free will, you know, it's in increasingly boring places. And, you know, if you want to claim it was free will such that you flossed your lower teeth today instead of your top ones, instead of the other, go for it, be happy, you know, you got free will there. In actuality, I don't think it's possible to look at this whole range of ways in which our behavior is being shaped by biology. I don't see there to be a shred of possibility of free will sitting in there. As far as I'm concerned, free will is what we call the biology that hasn't been discovered yet. I have absolutely no problem at all with the notion that there's no free will. I have vast problems with trying to imagine how are we supposed to live with that conclusion, and I have no idea what that should look like, but all I know is if we're going to do the hard work to try to get a sense of where that should be accepted, is we should probably start with the criminal justice system and worry about flossing somewhere down the line there. It's an enormous challenge, but there's some domains where it is absolutely essential that we do it, because basically the science that informs the current criminal justice system is based on neuroscience from the mid-19th century, and that's appalling. Yeah.
First of all, I must just say that your online course, the Human Behavioral Biology on YouTube, is like the main reason I applied to Stanford.
Oh, wow. Good. If you happen to know the president of Stanford, can you kind of mention that to him the next time you're hanging with him? Well, actually, I don't know. Have you paid your bills?
So I have questions. First, in that like when you introduce the maybe to these rats when you were levers, why was like evolutionary? How do we explain that increases dopamine?
Okay, because very few things out there have 100% certainty of you do the work, you get the reward. And what we hopefully get very good at is sensing where the optimum point is on that curve between effort and likelihood of reward. Now, what people are even better at is manipulating us into distorting what that curve looks like. And that's what Las Vegas is, where in actuality you have, what, 1/100 of 1% of a chance of good. But because today you're the lucky one who got the free drink and you're on the penthouse that they put you in that's actually on the second floor and all of that. And all of that is to set you up to mistake 1 chance in 100,000 for, I'm at about the 50% mark, up goes dopamine, there go the life savings. We're very good at realizing viscerally, dopaminergically, that intermittent reward demands a whole lot of behavior because it's very rewarding. We're lousy at accurately assessing exactly what the curve looks like.
Have you read the book by Judith Switch Harris, The Nurture Assumption? Because you did not mention parents that much here, so I'm just curious, do you agree with her parents are not that important in explaining, in explaining personality differences.
Well, it depends. When my kids are doing great, I don't believe that for a second. And context dependency, that's the whole point there. Harris is a psychologist who produced sort of the wildly controversial book in the mid-90s that in the most inflammatory form said, parents don't matter, give me a break. But she did a very good critique of a lot of the developmental literature in terms of parental effects. What she very legitimately emphasized was how at a surprisingly young age, how strong peer effects are on kids, enormously powerful. And where that is never more apparent is in teenagers. Peer conformity effects are astonishing there. For example, put an adult in a brain scanner, ask somebody, okay, how do you think of yourself? And they think of it, and there will be a certain pattern of neural activation. Now you say, how do other people think of you? And there is a partially overlapping pattern of cortical and subcortical activation. Take a teenager and say, what do you think of yourself? What do people think of you? You get the exact same pattern. What do I think of myself? Whatever anybody else thinks of me, because I'm going to go along with whatever. That's just one measure of it, and that's a measure of that frontal cortex, whose job it is in us as adults to say, you know, maybe they're actually jerks, and you shouldn't take their opinions to heart, and that's all the rationalizing and wait a second type stuff. She's absolutely right. Childhood and adolescence, even more so, enormous amount of peer effects.
Hi. I have a question here. Sorry,
Okay.
over here in the middle.
Okay, good.
I have two questions, actually. The first...
Look what you started. Okay.
You set precedent. The first question has to do with your discussion of the fear response to the rattlesnake, and later you mentioned that that fear response is conditioned. So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about some of the ways that the fear responses are conditioned, particularly with regard to other races. And then the second, I guess it's not a question, it's really a point, but you mentioned there were studies where adults had a higher amygdala reaction looking at faces that were different races than theirs. There's another similar study, but then they assessed how much contact these individuals had with these races over the course of their life, and they found that that was inversely correlated, so that the more contact they had with other races, the lower the amygdala response was, and vice versa.
Good, perfect. Okay, so in terms of the first one, rattlesnakes, what of these get your amygdala going things are innate? Even the things that are traditionally viewed as innate phobias that we have about snakes and spiders, the more technical term is that we show prepared learning for them. We are not innately afraid of spiders. It takes less aversive Okay, it takes less aversive experience with a spider to decide that you're afraid of it than with, say, like a Teletubby, for example. We are predisposed towards making some associations more readily than others. That's closer to what a phobia actually is. So the question becomes, do we have prepared learning for considering people of other races to be thems? A priori, intuitively, that makes perfect sense. I mean, it's such a marker and it's discernible at a distance and all of that. But then you think anthropologically for a second, and race evolved, I don't know, 40, 50, 100,000 years ago or so at most, somewhere during that period. And we've been humans for a lot longer than that. But most importantly, it only has been, okay, most importantly, it's only been, I don't know, in the last couple of millennia that your average person wound up within 1,000 miles of somebody from another race. Hominid history was not sculpted by encountering somebody from another race who represented as much of an other as you can imagine your whole life. It was utterly irrelevant because somebody's entire life was spent interacting with the people from the hunter-gatherer bands at most 2 or 3 valleys away. In terms of that other issue, the amygdaloid response, what you get at there is exactly, if one was being boringly technical and careful, every single time I would have said something during the talk, I would have said, on the average, this is what happens. On the average, people's amygdala activates when seeing the face of somebody from another race. So who are the people who are the exceptions? People who grew up in racially diverse neighborhoods. In other words, skin color is not a criterion for their us-them divide. People who've had a close, intimate relationship with somebody of another race, same exact conclusion. Okay, so good, let's put all of us back into kindergarten and we can undo some of the world's animosity in those lines. But then wonderful work by somebody at Princeton named Susan Fisk has shown something remarkable. Forget having to go back to preschool and the diversity in it. What Fisk does in these studies is putting somebody in a scanner and you're flashing up the faces there and the usual sort of deal. And she instructs people beforehand, okay, with each face that you see, decide yes or no, this button or that one. Decide, is this the sort of person who would like broccoli? Broccoli, like a lot of wars have been fought over broccoli. This is like totally innocuous broccoli. And what are you doing then? You're looking at each face and you're imagining them in a market. You're imagining them in a restaurant. You're imagining them coming home and sitting down to dinner. And does this taste good? And in other words, you're imagining them as an individual. And when you individuate people like that, the amygdala doesn't activate because you're too busy thinking about if they look happy or not, biting into whatever. You're thinking about them as a person. And you completely unwire the us-them at that point. So on one hand, we have the option to go back and put everyone back in kindergarten to different sorts of neighborhoods. But in a study like this is over the course of seconds, you rewire it. In other words, I think by the fact that we do us-them stuff in our amygdala in the course of 100 milliseconds, I think we are incredibly hardwired to divide the world into us and them and to not be all that fond of the thems. But it is incredibly easy to manipulate us as to who counts as an us and who counts as a them. And put a baseball cap on somebody and the neurobiology is different 100 milliseconds later, and that's the greatest example of that you can imagine.
There's an experiment here being conducted with transcranial magnetic induction to suppress the amygdala and stimulate the frontal lobes. Do you think this will work?
Well, depends what working counts as, but one of the most extraordinary things, I mean, neuroimaging puts somebody in a brain scanner, you're getting functional MRIs, you're seeing what parts of the brain activate in different that's totally cool, but it's correlative. This part of the brain's activity correlates with this behavior, this emotional state, whatever. Transcranial magnetic stimulation is a means by which you can actually activate or inhibit small subsets of cortical neurons. And that is amazing, some of the stuff that has come out of that. You turn off a part of the frontal cortex temporarily in somebody, and they make different sorts of moral decisions. You shift how utilitarian they are in runaway trolley type problems. And you are controlling their behavior in that case. This is mostly just a phenomenal research tool because you're moving away from a correlative relationship to a causal one. Aha, make those neurons fire, and suddenly this person is far more likely to say, yeah, I'll push him in front of the trolley. That's a strong causal relationship. What you can actually do with that down the line is the stuff of dreams and nightmares and everything in between. My guess is it's not going to be used in terribly exciting, abusive ways anytime soon, but it's a phenomenal research tool.
I think we're going to end there. Thank you so much.